Sometimes the past we run from is the only place left to call home. Clint spent 43 years wandering the rodeo circuit, burying memories too painful to face. When he returned to his grandfather's abandoned homestead with only a weary donkey beside him, he wasn't looking for anything but rest. Then the donkey pushed open the barn doors. Inside hung a preserved saddle, a faded photograph, and a note dated decades ago. For when you come back. Beneath the barn floor sat a chest filled with letters, maps and secrets his grandfather kept in silence, sacrifices made to preserve something Clint never knew existed. What was in that note, and why was his grandfather so certain he would return? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust rose in small clouds behind the truck as Clint turned off the county road onto what used to be a driveway. That word seemed too generous now. 2 ruts in the earth, barely visible through the weeds and saplings that had reclaimed the path, marked where vehicles once traveled regularly. He shifted into low gear and let the old Ford crawl forward, branches scraping against the sides like fingernails on glass. It had been 25 years since he'd last seen this place. A quarter-century of rodeos and bar stools, motel rooms and hospital waiting areas, belt buckles won and bones broken. The truck groaned as he navigated around a fallen pine that blocked half the path. In the rearview mirror, the trailer rocked gently, and he could see Rusty's long ears twitching at the flies. The donkey had been with him for the last 8 years, the longest relationship Clint had managed to maintain with any living thing. The trees finally opened up, and there it was. The homestead sat in a clearing that had once been carefully maintained, a space carved from the wilderness through generations of labor. Now the forest was taking it back, one season at a time. The house stood 2 stories tall, its white paint long since surrendered to gray, weathered wood. Shutters hung at angles, and the porch sagged in the middle like an old man's back. But the structure remained, stubbornly refusing to collapse despite years of neglect. Clint killed the engine and sat for a long moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant call of a crow. His chest felt tight. He'd been riding since dawn, driving since yesterday, running for 25 years. Now he was here, and he didn't quite know why. Maybe that wasn't true. He knew why. He just didn't want to admit it. He climbed out of the truck, his joints protesting. 43 wasn't old, but the rodeo had added years to his body that the calendar didn't show. 3 broken ribs, a shattered collarbone, more concussions than he cared to count. His left knee hadn't worked right since Tulsa, and his right shoulder sent up complaints every time the weather changed. The afternoon sun angled through the trees, golden and thick. Late September carried a coolness that hadn't been there in August, a whisper of the winter to come. Clint walked around to the trailer and lowered the ramp. Rusty backed out carefully, his hooves clopping on the metal, then stood blinking in the unfamiliar space. "Easy, boy," Clint said, running a hand down the donkey's neck. "We're home." The word felt strange in his mouth. He'd said it automatically, the way you do, but it landed wrong. This wasn't home. Home was something warm, something lived in. This was a ghost, a shell, a memory dressed in rotting wood. But his grandfather's voice came to him unbidden, that low rumble he'd heard 1,000 times as a boy. "Home ain't a feeling, son. It's a place you keep coming back to." Clint led Rusty toward what remained of the fence. The posts still stood, but the wire had rusted through in places, sagging into the weeds. He tied the donkey's lead to a solid-looking post and gave him a pat. "Stretch your legs." "I'm going to look around. The house first." The front steps creaked under his weight but held. The door was locked, but he knew where his grandfather had always kept the spare key. He felt along the top of the door frame, and his fingers found it immediately, a small piece of brass that weighed nothing but felt heavy in his palm. Inside, the air was thick and stale. Dust covered everything like a blanket, and the light filtering through dirty windows painted everything in shades of amber and shadow. The furniture sat exactly as he remembered it, The old sofa with the sunken cushions, the rocking chair by the cold fireplace, the dining table where he'd eaten 1,000 meals. Photographs still hung on the walls, their faces bleached pale by time and sun. One in particular caught his eye. He walked over to it, his boots leaving prints in the dust on the floor. 3 figures stood on this very porch, his grandfather in the middle, young and strong, his father on the left, barely out of his teens, and his grandmother on the right, her smile bright. The photo was older than Clint, taken before his father met his mother, before everything fell apart. His grandmother had died when his father was 20. Heart attack, sudden and final. His father had never quite recovered from it. Neither had his grandfather, though he'd hidden it better. Clint could see it now, looking at the photo with older eyes. The sadness lived in the smile, in the way his grandfather's hand rested on his grandmother's shoulder, holding on. He moved through the room slowly, cataloguing the decay. Mice had made nests in the kitchen cabinets. Water stains marked the ceiling in the hallway, but the bones of the house were good, the foundations solid. It could be salvaged if someone cared enough to do the work. Upstairs, his old room waited. The bed was still made, the quilt his grandmother had sewn pulled tight across the mattress. His high school rodeo trophies gathered dust on the shelf. A coiled lariat hung from a nail on the wall. He'd left so fast that morning, carrying nothing but rage and hurt, that he'd abandoned everything. His grandfather had kept it all, preserved it like a museum exhibit. For when you come back, he could almost hear the old man say, but his grandfather wasn't here to say anything anymore. Clint had learned about the death from a lawyer's letter that had found him in Amarillo 6 months ago. 5 years late, forwarded through a chain of addresses as the attorney tried to track him down. The funeral was long past. The estate was settled. Clint was the sole heir. The land was his if he wanted it. He'd carried that letter in his truck for half a year, reading it and rereading it, before he'd finally pointed the truck north and started driving. Outside, Rusty brayed, a long honking sound that echoed across the clearing. Clint went to the window and looked out. The donkey was pulling at his lead, stretching towards something. The barn. Clint had been avoiding the barn. He descended the stairs and went back outside. The sun was lower now, painting everything in deeper gold. He walked across the overgrown yard toward the barn, and with each step, memories rose like ghosts. His grandfather teaching him to rope on a hay bale with a pair of horns nailed to it. The smell of horses and leather. The sound of his grandfather's voice, patient and steady, always patient, always steady. Keep your loop open, son. Don't choke it. Let it breathe. The barn was bigger than the house, a massive structure with a peaked roof and wide doors. It leaned slightly to the east, its red paint faded to rust and grey, but it still stood. His grandfather had built things to last. Rusty brayed again, more insistent now. The donkey was pulling hard at the lead, his eyes fixed on the barn doors. "What is it?" Clint asked, walking over. "What do you smell?" He untied the donkey, and Rusty immediately moved toward the barn, his hooves crunching through the dry grass. Clint followed, a strange tightness building in his chest. The barn doors were closed, held by a simple wooden latch. He reached for it, then hesitated. Behind these doors were more memories, more ghosts, more evidence of everything he'd walked away from. Rusty pushed his nose against the doors and snorted, then looked back at Clint as if to say, "Well, all right," Clint said. "All right." He lifted the latch and pulled. The doors swung outward on hinges that squealed in protest. Rusty stepped forward into the darkness, and Clint followed. The inside of the barn was dim, lit only by the failing daylight filtering through gaps in the walls. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light, swirling in the air, disturbed by the open doors. The smell hit him immediately. Old hay, aged wood, and something else. Leather, oil, care. His eyes adjusted slowly. The barn was mostly empty. No horses, no equipment, just empty stalls and bare walls. But in the center of the space, illuminated by a shaft of light from a hole in the roof, something hung from a beam. A saddle. Clint walked toward it, as if in a dream. The saddle hung from a rope at perfect height, neither touching the ground nor too high to reach. It was his grandfather's saddle, the one he'd used for 50 years. Hand-tooled leather with a pattern of roses and vines, the work of a craftsman from another era. The leather gleamed. Not a speck of dust, not a crack, not a sign of age or neglect. Someone had maintained it. Someone had oiled it, conditioned it, kept it perfect. Beside the saddle, pinned to a wooden post, was a photograph. Clint stepped closer, his heart pounding. The photo showed a boy of maybe 8 years old standing next to an old man. Both wore cowboy hats. Both were smiling. The boy's hand rested on a saddle that sat between them on a sawhorse, and the old man's hand rested on the boy's shoulder. Clint and his grandfather. 25 years ago in this very barn, his vision blurred. He blinked hard, trying to clear it, and that's when he saw the note. It was pinned to the saddle itself, a piece of paper that had yellowed with time. The handwriting was unmistakable, his grandfather's careful script, formed by a man who'd learned to write late in life and treated every letter with respect. For when you come back, that was all it said. 7 words. A date below, 20 years ago. 5 years before his grandfather died, Clint's knees felt weak. He reached out and touched the saddle, his fingers running over the smooth leather. It was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Someone, his grandfather, had spent years taking care of it, preserving it, waiting for Clint to come home. He sank down onto a hay bale that sat nearby, his hands shaking. Rusty moved closer, pushing his nose against Clint's shoulder in a gesture of comfort. The donkey knew. Animals always knew. He waited, Clint whispered. He knew I'd come back, but it was too late. His grandfather was gone. The waiting was over, and Clint had arrived after the story ended, or maybe this was where the story began. He looked around the barn with new eyes. The saddle wasn't the only thing here. Against the far wall, barely visible in the shadows, something else waited. A trunk or a chest of some kind. Clint stood and walked toward it. Rusty followed, his hooves echoing in the empty space. The chest was old, hand-carved from oak, darkened with age. It sat in a corner where the light didn't quite reach. He knelt beside it and ran his hands over the surface. More of his grandfather's work. The man had been good with his hands, building and fixing and creating. The chest had a simple latch but no lock. Clint lifted the lid. Inside were papers. Stacks of them, bundled with twine and organized with the same careful precision his grandfather had brought to everything. Letters, maps, documents, and what looked like a journal bound in leather. On top, another note, this one more recent. 5 years old, based on the date. Clint, everything you need to know is here. Take your time. Read it all. I'm sorry I'm not there to tell you in person, but this is better. This way you can know everything without an old man's pride getting in the way. The land is yours. What you do with it is up to you. But know that I believed in you. I always believed in you. Every day, every year. I knew you'd come back when you were ready. Love, Grandpa. The tears came then, hot and fast, and Clint didn't try to stop them. He sat on the barn floor with his grandfather's words in his hands and cried like he hadn't cried since he was a boy. Rusty stood beside him, patient and steady, and the last light of day filtered through the holes in the roof, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. Morning came cold and clear. Clint had slept in his truck, unable to face the house just yet, and woke with a stiff neck and the taste of old coffee in his mouth. Rusty grazed nearby, unbothered by the dew that soaked the grass. The donkey looked up as Clint climbed out of the cab, offered a soft bray of greeting, then went back to his breakfast. Clint walked to the barn with purpose. The chest waited where he'd left it, and he'd spent half the night thinking about those papers, those letters, that journal. His grandfather had left him something more than land. He'd left him answers to questions Clint hadn't known he needed to ask. The morning sun angled through the barn doors, illuminating the chest in clear light. Clint knelt beside it and carefully removed the first bundle of letters. The twine was old but held firm. He untied it and spread the letters out on the floor, organizing them by date. He'd read for perhaps 20 minutes when Rusty wandered into the barn and began exploring. The donkey sniffed at corners, investigated empty stalls, and generally made himself at home. Clint paid him little mind, absorbed in a letter from his grandfather to a bank, dated 18 years ago. The language was formal, almost pleading. A request for an extension on a loan payment. Rusty's hooves clomped across the wooden floor. The sound changed slightly, became more hollow. The donkey stopped and pawed at a spot near the center of the barn, his hoof scraping against the wood. "Quit that," Clint said, not looking up. "You'll splinter the floor." But Rusty didn't quit. He pawed again, more insistently, then brayed, a loud, demanding sound that echoed through the barn. Clint looked up, annoyed. "What's gotten into you?" The donkey stared at him, then deliberately pawed the floor again. Clint stood and walked over. "What is just—" He stopped. The boards where Rusty stood looked different from the others. Newer, maybe, or at least less weathered. And when Clint knelt and pressed down on one, it shifted slightly, not quite flush with the others. "Well," he said, looking at Rusty, "you got good eyes for a donkey." He ran his fingers along the edge of the board and felt a gap. Not much of one, but enough. He worked his fingers into the space and pulled. The board came up easily, revealing that it wasn't nailed down at all. Just set in place. Beneath it was darkness and a smell of earth and age. Clint pulled up 2 more boards, setting them aside. The hole beneath was about 3 feet square, dug deliberately into the ground under the barn. And in that hole, sitting on what looked like a piece of canvas to protect it from moisture, was another chest. This one was bigger than the first, heavier looking, hand-carved like the other but with different markings, his grandfather's initials and a date. 25 years ago. The year Clint left. His hands shook as he reached down and grabbed the handles. The chest was heavy, solidly built, and when he lifted it, he heard things shifting inside. He hauled it up and set it on the barn floor beside the first chest. Rusty sniffed at it, seeming satisfied with his discovery. "Good boy," Clint said quietly. "Good boy." The chest had a simple latch, no lock. His grandfather had never been one for locks. He used to say that if a man wanted to steal from you bad enough, a lock wouldn't stop him, and if he didn't, you didn't need one. Clint opened the lid. Inside was a lifetime of secrets. Letters filled the top layer, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Below that, maps rolled up and tied with string. And beneath those, wrapped in oilcloth, a leather-bound journal that looked like it had been written in regularly for years. Clint pulled out the first letter. It was addressed to his grandfather from the First National Bank, dated 24 years ago. A foreclosure notice. The language was cold and professional, but the message was clear. Pay what you owe or lose the property. He pulled out another. A letter from his grandfather to the bank, asking for time, explaining the situation. His son, Clint's father, had taken out loans against the property without permission, forged documents, gambled the money away. The grandfather had only just discovered it. He was working to make it right, but he needed time. The response from the bank was less sympathetic. Pay or lose the land. Clint sat back, processing. His father had nearly cost them everything. He'd known his father had problems, the drinking, the gambling, the anger, but he'd never known it went this deep. He kept reading. Letter after letter, a paper trail of struggle. His grandfather had taken on double shifts at the sawmill. He'd sold equipment. He'd taken out personal loans at rates that made Clint wince, all to save the property. And he'd done it alone, telling no one. There were letters from a law firm, correspondence about property surveys and title searches, letters from a development company, Riverside Development LLC, making offers to buy the property. The first offer was low but reasonable. The second offer, 6 months later, was higher. The third, a year after that, was generous. His grandfather had refused them all. Clint unrolled the maps. They were professional survey documents, the kind that cost real money to commission. The property boundaries were marked in red, every acre accounted for. Notations in his grandfather's handwriting marked water sources, timber stands, and terrain features. One map showed elevation changes and what looked like geological markings. Another map, more recent, showed something else, property lines for adjacent parcels, including one marked Riverside Development Phase 1. Clint recognized the location. It was land that had belonged to his grandfather, a 20-acre parcel separate from the main homestead. He'd forgotten about it, if he'd ever really known it existed. But according to these maps, his grandfather had sold it. 15 years ago, to Riverside Development, Clint felt something cold settle in his stomach. His grandfather had sold his own land to the company that wanted to buy the homestead. That didn't make sense. Unless he reached for the journal and opened it to the first page. The date was 25 years ago, and the handwriting was his grandfather's, though shakier than in recent years. Today, Clint left. Drove off before dawn without a word. I heard the truck start up and went to the window, but by the time I got there, he was already gone. Can't say I blame him. His father was cruel last night, said things no boy should have to hear. I tried to stop it, but James wouldn't listen. Never does when he's been drinking. Clint's throat tightened. He'd never known his grandfather had witnessed that final argument. He'd thought the old man was asleep. He read on. The entries were sporadic at first, brief notes about daily life and worries about Clint. Then they became more frequent, more detailed. His grandfather had discovered the forged documents, the secret loans, the extent of his son's betrayal. He'd decided to fix it no matter the cost. James left today. Said he couldn't face what he'd done. Maybe that's true, or maybe he just couldn't face the work of fixing it. Either way, he's gone. Mary's been gone 30 years now, James is gone, and Clint is gone. I'm alone here with a mountain of debt and a property they're trying to take from me. But I won't let them. This land belongs to Clint. It's his inheritance, his birthright. I'll keep it for him until he comes back. Clint had to stop reading. His eyes burned, and his chest felt like someone had wrapped a chain around it and pulled tight. His grandfather had fought this battle alone, for him, while Clint was off chasing belt buckles and temporary glory. He forced himself to keep reading. The journal chronicled years of struggle, of working multiple jobs, of scraping together payments. His grandfather had been strategic, negotiating with creditors, buying time, working angles. And slowly, over years, he'd made progress. Then came the entry from 15 years ago. Made a decision today. Riverside is offering good money for the back 20. More than it's worth, really. They know what's under there, water mostly. Good aquifer. And water's going to be worth more than gold in the coming years. They want it bad. But they want the whole property more, and I won't give them that. So I made them a deal. They get the 20 acres, and they stop pursuing the main homestead. They agreed. The money from the sale will clear the remaining debt on this place. It means I'll never build that retirement cabin I was planning, but that's all right. I'd rather Clint have this land free and clear than have a cabin for myself. A man's legacy isn't land he dies on. It's what he leaves behind. Clint closed the journal and sat in the silence of the barn. Around him, the walls creaked in the morning breeze. Dust drifted through shafts of sunlight. Rusty munched hay in a stall, content and unconcerned. His grandfather had sacrificed his own dreams to preserve Clint's inheritance, had worked himself to exhaustion, had given up his retirement, had fought a battle that lasted decades, all for a grandson who'd run away and never looked back. The weight of it pressed down on Clint's shoulders like physical thing. Guilt, yes, but something else too. Responsibility, purpose, a debt that couldn't be repaid in money but had to be answered somehow. He looked around the barn with new eyes. This wasn't just a building. It was a testament. Evidence of love that endured through silence and absence, through years and struggle. His grandfather had believed Clint would come back. Had worked to make sure there was something to come back to, and now Clint was here, finally. Too late to say thank you, but perhaps not too late to honor what had been given. He gathered the letters carefully, placing them back in the chest. The maps he rolled up gently. The journal he held for a moment longer, feeling the weight of all those words, all those years. "I'm here, Grandpa," he said to the empty barn. "I'm here. I just wish I'd come sooner." Rusty brayed softly, as if in agreement. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The day was waiting, full of questions and decisions and possibilities. But for now, Clint sat on the barn floor, surrounded by his grandfather's secrets. And he read. Clint spent the rest of that morning and most of the afternoon reading through the first bundle of letters. the ones that chronicled his grandfather's financial battle. He'd moved to the porch of the house, wanting daylight and air, and spread the papers out in chronological order. The story they told made his chest ache. The first letter, dated 24 years ago, was from First National Bank. Formal language, but the threat was clear. The property had loans against it that were in default. Payment was required within 60 days, or foreclosure proceedings would begin. His grandfather's response, dated a week later, was careful and dignified. He explained that his son had taken out the loans without his knowledge, using forged documents. He was working with law enforcement, but that wouldn't solve the immediate problem. He requested an extension and proposed a payment plan. The bank's reply was less generous than he'd hoped, but not entirely unforgiving. They'd grant a 90-day extension, but after that, payments must be current or they'd have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure. What followed was a paper trail of desperation hidden behind polite language. His grandfather had immediately taken on extra shifts at the sawmill where he'd worked for 30 years. Letters to the mill supervisor confirmed this, requests to work nights, weekends, any available hours. The supervisor's responses showed concern, but granted the requests. Letters to the county assessor asking about property tax obligations. Could payments be deferred? Could they be stretched out? The answer was sympathetic but firm. No, a letter to a second mortgage company asking about terms. The rates they quoted made Clint wince even now. 15% interest. His grandfather had taken it anyway. Over the next several years, the letters tracked a grinding struggle. Payments made on time, but barely. Months where his grandfather wrote to the bank asking for understanding. The mill had cut hours, or there'd been an unexpected expense, or winter had been harder than usual, always followed by assurance that the next payment would come, and it always did. Clint found himself building a picture of his grandfather's life during those years. Up before dawn, working the early shift at the mill, home to do maintenance on the property, then back to the mill for night shift. 4 hours of sleep, then start again. Day after day, month after month, year after year. There were letters from a lawyer, too. His father had been found, apparently, and there were attempts to hold him legally responsible for the forged loans. But his father had nothing, no assets, no income they could garnish. He'd disappeared into a bottle and never really come back out. The lawyer's correspondence grew more sparse and finally stopped. There was nothing to be done. Mixed in with the financial letters were others that told a different story. Correspondence from Riverside Development LLC. The first letter was almost casual, dated 22 years ago. An inquiry about whether the property might be for sale. The company was looking to expand operations in the area and thought the homestead might be suitable for their purposes. His grandfather's reply was polite but firm. Not interested. 6 months later, another letter from Riverside. They'd had the property surveyed from public records and noticed it had good timber, good water access, and excellent development potential. They were prepared to make a serious offer. The number they mentioned was fair, maybe even generous. His grandfather declined again. The letters from Riverside continued, increasing in frequency and urgency. They really wanted this land. The offers got better. Each time his grandfather refused. Clint could almost feel the developer's frustration in the increasingly terse language. Then came a letter that changed the tone entirely. It was from a lawyer representing Riverside, dated 20 years ago. They'd discovered that the property had outstanding debts that exceeded its current market value. They were prepared to buy out those debts at a discount and take possession of the property to satisfy them. Legal language followed, outlining their rights and intentions. It was a threat dressed in legal terminology, but a threat nonetheless. They were going to take the land one way or another. His grandfather's response, written in his own hand rather than typed by a lawyer, was remarkable for its restraint. He acknowledged their interest and their legal right to pursue the debts. But he made it clear he would fight every step of the way, and he knew they'd have to prove their case in court, which would take time and money. He suggested they might want to reconsider their approach. For a while, The letters from Riverside stopped. But Clint knew from the journal that the battle was far from over. His grandfather had used the breathing room to work even harder, to make larger payments, to chip away at the debt. There were letters from other creditors too. Medical bills from when his grandfather had fallen from the barn roof and broken his arm. He'd worked through it one-handed until it healed. Truck repairs, property insurance, taxes. Each obligation met, each deadline honored, through sheer force of will. Clint found himself reading one letter over and over. It was from the mill supervisor, dated 15 years ago. His grandfather had asked about retirement benefits, whether he could cash them out early. The supervisor's response was gentle, but worried. He strongly advised against it. Those benefits were meant to support him in old age. If he cashed them out now, he'd have nothing later. His grandfather had cashed them out anyway. The money had gone directly to the bank, shaving years off the repayment timeline. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Clint finally set down the last letter in the bundle. His hands trembled slightly. The picture was complete now, or at least part of it. His grandfather had fought a quiet, determined battle against debt, against time, against a development company that wanted his land. He'd worked himself to exhaustion, sacrificed his health, and given up any thought of an easy retirement, all for this place. All for Clint. The guilt that had been building all day finally crested. Clint stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the overgrown property. What right did he have to this? He'd done nothing to earn it. Had run away, in fact, at the first sign of trouble. While his grandfather fought and sacrificed, Clint had been chasing buckles and glory, concerned with nothing more substantial than an 8-second ride. But mixed with the guilt was something else, a growing sense of understanding. His grandfather hadn't done this out of obligation or duty. The letters made that clear. He'd done it out of love, out of belief that Clint would come back someday and need a place to come back to. The question now was whether Clint could be worthy of that belief. He heard hooves on wood and turned to see Rusty climbing the porch steps. The donkey shouldn't have been able to get up here, but the animal was surprisingly nimble when he wanted to be. Rusty walked over and pushed his nose against Clint's chest, a gesture of comfort and companionship. "I know," Clint said, scratching behind the donkey's ears. "I know." The sun was setting now, painting the clearing in shades of orange and purple. The barn stood dark against the light, solid and patient. The house creaked around him, settling into the cool of evening. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, marking the transition from day to night. Clint gathered the letters and carried them inside, setting them carefully on the dining room table. There was more to read, so much more. The journal, the other letters, the maps. Each held pieces of a story he was only beginning to understand, but tonight he needed to stop, to let what he'd learned settle, to process the weight of his grandfather's sacrifice and decide what it meant for him. He found some old blankets in a closet upstairs and made a bed for himself on the couch. Rusty settled on the porch, content to stand guard. And as darkness fell over the homestead, Clint lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the past and wondering about the future. The next morning brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the clearing gray and made the inside of the house feel like a cave. Clint woke stiff and sore, his body protesting the couch and the accumulated years of rodeo damage. He made coffee on a camp stove he'd brought from the truck, then returned to the chest in the barn, pulling out the second bundle of letters. These were different, addressed to him every one, but the envelopes were unsealed, never sent. His grandfather had written to him regularly, it seemed, like a man keeping a journal, but directing it toward an absent audience. Clint carried the bundle back to the house and settled at the dining room table. Rain drummed on the roof. Rusty stood under the porch overhang, his ears twitching at the drops that occasionally blew sideways and hit his face. The first letter was dated 1 month after Clint had left. "Dear Clint, you've been gone a month now, and the house feels bigger without you in it. I heard you won 3rd place at a rodeo in Casper. Martha Hendricks saw it in the paper and brought it by. She thought I'd want to know." "I did. I'm proud of you, son. Always have been. I know why you left. Your father said things no man should say to his boy. He was drunk and angry and scared, and he took it out on you. That wasn't right. But I want you to know, whatever he said, it wasn't true. You're a good man, Clint. You're going to do fine out there. Clint had to stop reading. His vision blurred and he wiped at his eyes roughly. He'd won that buckle in Casper, had sold it a month later to pay for entry fees to the next rodeo. It had never occurred to him that anyone back home would know about it, much less care. He forced himself to continue. The letters came monthly at first, then less frequently, but they never stopped entirely. His grandfather wrote about daily life on the homestead, about weather and repairs and neighbors. He wrote about memories, teaching Clint to ride, to rope, to read the land. He wrote about regret, wishing he'd stepped in sooner when Clint's father was drinking, wishing he'd done more to heal the family before it fractured. But mostly, he wrote about hope. The barn needs a new roof, and I'm saving up for it. By the time you come back, I'll have it fixed proper. Want to make sure everything's ready. Saw your name in the results from Cheyenne. Second place in bull riding. Your grandmother would have been scared to death watching that, but proud too. I'm just proud, getting harder to climb ladders these days. Arthritis in my hands, but I keep up with the maintenance. When you come back, I want you to see the place taken care of, the way it should be. Always when you come back, never if. The certainty in those words hit Clint like a physical weight. His grandfather had never doubted. Through years of silence, through Clint's complete absence, the old man had believed. The letters chronicled his grandfather's aging. Mentions of doctor visits began appearing, casual at first, then more frequent. Arthritis, high blood pressure, a heart that wasn't as strong as it used to be. But the complaints were brief, always followed by reassurances that he was managing fine. Doctor says I should take it easier, but what does he know? I've got work to do here. Can't let things slide. You'll be back someday, and I want it ready. 15 years into the correspondence, the tone shifted slightly. His grandfather had sold the 20 acres to Riverside Development. The letter explaining it was longer than most, more detailed. Made a hard choice today, Clint. Sold off the back 20 to that development company that's been sniffing around. Got a good price, better than the land was worth, really. They wanted the aquifer access, and I let them have it. Used the money to pay off the last of the debt on this place. The homestead is free and clear now. Your father's mistakes are paid for. When you come back, this land will be yours with no strings attached. That back 20 was going to be my retirement spot, place I planned to build a little cabin and sit on the porch in my old age. But I'd rather you have this place clear than me have that. A man's legacy isn't land he dies on. It's what he leaves behind. Clint read that paragraph 3 times. His grandfather had given up his retirement dream. Had worked until the day he died instead of building that cabin, taking that ease. All to give Clint a fresh start. The later letters grew more philosophical. His grandfather had always been a man of few words in person, but on paper, with no one to hear him, he'd opened up in ways Clint had never experienced. Been thinking about family lately, about how we pass things down. Not just land and possessions, but patterns, ways of being. Your father inherited my stubbornness, but not my patience. Maybe that was my fault, or maybe it was just how he was made. He inherited his mother's pain when she died, and he never figured out how to set it down. Carried it his whole life, and it poisoned him. I don't want that for you. You're stubborn like us, but you got something else too. You've got the courage to leave when you need to. That's important. Sometimes a man needs to go away to figure out who he is. I understand that. Just know that when you're done figuring it out, there's a place here waiting. The letters from the last few years were shorter, the handwriting shakier. His grandfather's health was clearly failing, but he never complained directly. Instead, he wrote about gratitude, thankful for the life I've had. Good woman who loved me, son who struggled but tried, grandson who I got to teach and watch grow, even if only for a little while. This land that's been in our family 3 generations now, I've done my part to keep it going. Rest is up to you whenever you're ready. The final letter was dated 5 years ago, just months before his grandfather died. Feeling tired lately. Doctor says my heart's wearing out. Suppose that happens to all of us eventually. But I'm not worried. I've done what I needed to do. The land is secure. The documents are all in the barn, organized for you. Everything you need to know is written down. I wish I could be there when you come back. Would like to see your face, hear about your life. But if I'm not, just know I'm proud of you. Always was, always will be. The land is yours. Do with it what you think is right. Love, Grandpa? Clint sat at that table until the coffee went cold and the rain stopped. The letters were spread out before him like pieces of a map showing the geography of his grandfather's heart. He'd been loved, completely unconditionally from a distance. Loved enough that an old man worked himself to death to leave something behind. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, clouds were breaking up, letting through scattered sunlight. Rusty had ventured out into the wet grass and was rolling in a patch of mud, something he did when he was content. Clint's hands pressed against the windowsill. He felt hollowed out and filled up at the same time. The guilt was still there, but something else had joined it. A sense of purpose, maybe, or responsibility, or maybe just the recognition that love, like his grandfather's, demanded an answer. He gathered the letters carefully and placed them back in their bundle. There was still more to read. The journal held years of daily entries he hadn't touched. But he needed air, needed to move, needed to think. He stepped out onto the porch and looked around the property with new eyes. Not just seeing the decay and neglect, but seeing what it had been and could be again. His grandfather had believed in him enough to save this place. The question was whether Clint believed in himself enough to do something with it. By afternoon, the sun had burned through the clouds completely, and Clint found himself back in the barn with the maps spread across a work table he'd cleared off. These weren't simple property surveys. They were professional geological and timber assessments, the kind that cost real money to commission. The first map showed the property boundaries in detail. 80 acres total, shaped roughly like a boot. The eastern edge bordered national forest land. The western edge ran along the county road. North and south were private holdings, other homesteads and ranches that had been there for generations. But it was the notations that caught Clint's attention. His grandfather had marked water sources, 3 springs and 1 significant stream that ran along the northern boundary. Beside each notation was additional information in a different hand, probably the surveyor's: depth to water table, estimated flow rates, aquifer connection points. The water notation for the main spring read primary aquifer access, flow rate 50+ gallons per minute. Excellent quality. Significant commercial value. Clint stared at that last phrase. Significant commercial value. He'd always known there was water on the property, but he'd thought of it the way a rancher thinks of water. Something necessary for livestock and life, not a commodity. But someone had seen it differently. The timber assessment was equally detailed. His grandfather had acres of old-growth pine and fir, trees that had been standing for 100 years or more. The surveyor had marked individual stands, estimated board feet, and calculated market value. The numbers made Clint blink. Conservative estimate, 2.5 million board feet. Current market value, substantial. Note, sustainable harvest could provide ongoing income without depleting resource. Clint did the math in his head. Even at conservative prices, that was serious money. Not get-rich money, but enough to make a real difference. Enough to matter. Enough that a development company would be very interested. He unrolled the third map, and pieces fell into place. This one showed not just his grandfather's property, but the surrounding area. The 20 acres his grandfather had sold to Riverside Development were marked clearly, and beyond them, more parcels, all marked with the Riverside name and dates of acquisition. They'd been buying up land in this area for 20 years. A pattern emerged as Clint studied the map. They were assembling something big, piece by piece. His grandfather's homestead sat right in the middle of their holdings, a holdout, an obstacle to whatever plan they had. The water was the key. Clint could see it now. The aquifer ran through this whole valley, but the best access points were on his grandfather's land and the parcel he'd sold. Riverside had gotten one piece, but wanted the other. Needed it, probably, for their development to work. A folder tucked between 2 maps contained more documentation. Mineral rights papers, going back decades, water rights filings, legal opinions about access and usage. His grandfather had done his homework, had understood what he was sitting on. One document was a copy of a letter from Riverside's lawyer, dated 19 years ago. It outlined their final offer for the property. The number was staggering, far more than market value for a remote homestead. But attached to it was a response from his grandfather's lawyer, pointing out that the offer, while generous, represented a fraction of the property's true value once water rights and timber assets were factored in. The correspondence continued. Riverside had tried legal pressure, suggesting they could claim adverse possession of the water rights due to historical use patterns. His grandfather's lawyer had demolished that argument with citations and precedents. Then Riverside had shifted tactics, offering to buy just the water rights, leaving his grandfather the land. He'd refused that too. Finally, they'd settled on the compromise. Riverside got the back 20 acres with its aquifer access. His grandfather kept the main homestead, and both parties agreed to leave each other alone. The contract was explicit. Riverside gave up all claims to the remaining 80 acres in exchange for full rights to the 20. It was a good deal, Clint realized. His grandfather had gotten what he needed, freedom from debt and pressure, while giving up land he wasn't using anyway. And Riverside had gotten enough access to make their development work, even if they'd had to pay premium price for it. He found himself looking at the property with different eyes now. This wasn't just his grandfather's sentimental attachment to family land. This was a valuable asset, carefully preserved and protected. The old man had been strategic, had understood the value of what he held, and had fought to keep it not out of stubbornness, but out of wisdom. Clint walked outside and stood at the edge of the clearing, looking at the tree line. Old-growth forest, valuable beyond its lumber, important for watershed protection, for wildlife habitat, for a dozen things the surveyor's report had noted. His grandfather had made notes in the margins about sustainable forestry practices, about selective cutting that would maintain the forest's health while providing income. He'd had a plan, not just to save the land, but to make it work, to make it sustainable. Rusty wandered over and stood beside him, and Clint found himself talking to the donkey, the way he often did when his thoughts got too heavy to hold alone. He wasn't just some stubborn old man holding on to the past, Clint said. He was thinking about the future, my future. He saw what this place could be and worked to make it possible. The donkey's ear twitched, listening. Question is whether I'm smart enough to see what he saw, whether I can take what he left and actually do something with it. He walked the property for the next 2 hours, following the survey maps, locating each marked feature. The springs were exactly where noted, flowing clear and cold. The timber stands were healthy, well spaced from natural thinning. The land had good bones, as his grandfather would have said. Near the northern boundary, he found something else, a stone marker with his family name carved into it, and a date from 70 years ago. His great-grandfather's work, staking his claim. 3 generations had held this land. His grandfather had been determined that there would be a 4th. The weight of that history settled on Clint's shoulders, but it didn't feel crushing. It felt grounding, like an anchor holding him steady in a current that had been pulling him along for years. As evening approached, he saw movement on the county road. A truck slowed and turned onto the old driveway, navigating carefully around the fallen pine. Clint watched it come, curious. He hadn't seen another person since he arrived. The truck pulled into the clearing and stopped. An old man climbed out, moving slowly but steady. He was probably 75, weathered and solid, wearing work clothes that had seen better days. "You'd be Clint," the man said. "Not a question. I would." "Figured. You look like your grandfather." "I'm Earl Henderson. Worked with him at the mill for 40 years. He walked over and extended his hand. His grip was firm despite his age. "Sorry about your loss," Earl said. "Should have been said 5 years ago, but nobody knew where you were." "I didn't know he'd passed until 6 months ago," Clint said. "Took me a while to get here." Earl nodded, understanding in his eyes. "He always said you'd come back. We had our doubts, but he never did, so I'm learning." Earl looked around the property, taking in the overgrowth, the sagging structures. Place needs work. It does. You planning to stay or just settling the estate? Clint was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, he realized he'd already made his decision. Maybe he'd made it days ago, or maybe it had been made for him by the accumulated weight of all he'd learned. Either way, he knew the answer. "I'm staying," he said. "Gonna fix it up. Make it work." Earl smiled, a slow spread across his weathered face. He'd be glad to hear that. Real glad. He paused, then added, "If you need help, there's folks around who remember what he did, how he fought. They'd be willing to lend a hand." "I'd appreciate that," Clint said. "Got a lot to learn." "Well," Earl said, turning back toward his truck, "you come from good stock. You'll figure it out. And like I said, we're around if you need us." He drove away as the sun touched the horizon, leaving Clint alone again with Rusty and the land and the future that was suddenly, terrifyingly within reach. That night, Clint finally opened his grandfather's journal fully and began reading from the beginning. He'd seen snippets before, individual entries that had caught his eye. But now he read it properly, chronologically, letting the story unfold as his grandfather had lived it. The journal began 25 years ago, the day after Clint left. Clint drove off this morning. Didn't say goodbye. Can't blame him. His father was cruel last night, words that cut deep. "I should have stepped in sooner, stopped it before it got that bad. But I thought they could work it out, father and son. I was wrong. Sometimes a boy has to leave to become a man. I understand that. Did the same thing myself at his age. Took me 10 years to come back, and by then, my own father was gone. I won't make that mistake. I'll be here when Clint comes back, however long it takes." The early entries were short, daily notations about work and weather and the routine of living. But threaded through them was concern for both his son and grandson. Clint's father had spiraled after Clint left, the drinking getting worse, the gambling debts mounting. James came by today asking for money. Said he owed people, said they were threatening him. I gave him what I had, but I know it won't be enough. It never is. He's got Mary's pain in him, the hole she left when she died, and he's been trying to fill it with whiskey and cards for 20 years. Nothing I say makes a difference. I try to love him through it, but love isn't always enough. 6 months into the journal, his grandfather discovered the forged loan documents. The entries from that week were longer, more anguished than usual. Found out what James did today. He forged my signature on loan papers borrowed against the property. Near about $30,000, and it's all gone. Gambled it away or drank it, doesn't matter which. The bank wants payment, and I don't have it. Thought about going to the police, pressing charges. He's my son, but what he did could cost us everything. In the end, I couldn't do it. Mary would never forgive me. So I'll fix it myself somehow. The land belongs to Clint. It's his inheritance. I won't let James's mistakes take that from him. The next several years of entries chronicled the grinding work of paying off those debts. His grandfather took every shift available, sold equipment, took out high-interest personal loans. The entries were exhausted, the handwriting sometimes shaky from working too many hours on too little. Sleep, but interspersed with the financial struggle were entries about Clint. His grandfather had followed his rodeo career through newspapers and word of mouth, tracking his grandson's movement across the West. Heard Clint won the bull riding in Colorado Springs. 20 years old and already making a name for himself. I'm proud, but I worry too. Bull riding is dangerous work. Lost a friend to it when I was young, but Clint was always fearless. Gets that from Mary, I think. She was afraid of nothing. The journal also chronicled his father's decline. He'd left the area entirely drifting south. Occasional letters came, full of apologies and promises to change. His grandfather always responded with love, but never with money. Got a letter from James today. He's in Arizona working construction. Says he's sober. I hope it's true, but I've heard it before. Told him I love him, that there's always a place here if he wants to come back and face what he did. Haven't heard back. Maybe I won't. 10 years into the journal, the tone shifted. His grandfather had been contacted by Riverside Development. The entries about that correspondence were thoughtful, strategic. Development company wants to buy the place. offering good money. But I did some research. They've been buying up parcels all through this valley. They're planning something big. Had a surveyor come out, cost me 3 months' wages, but I needed to know what I was sitting on. Turns out the water rights alone are worth more than their offer. The timber too. This land is valuable more than I knew. Makes sense why they want it. But I'm not selling. Not the main property anyway. That's Clint's future. The journal revealed his grandfather's strategic thinking. He'd negotiated with Riverside for years, always polite but firm. He'd used their interest as leverage with the bank, showing that the property had value, that he wasn't a bad risk. And finally, he'd engineered the compromise that saved everything, made the deal with Riverside today. They get the back 20, I keep the homestead free and clear. The money from the sale covers every debt, with some left over. I'm putting that extra in an account for Clint. Not much, but it's something. The back 20 was going to be my retirement spot. Place I planned to build a cabin. Been dreaming about it for years. Sitting on the porch in my old age, watching the sun set over the valley. But dreams change. This is better. Clint will have this land with no strings, no debts. That's worth more than any cabin. The later entries became more philosophical as his grandfather's health declined. He reflected on family, on patterns of pain and healing, on legacy. Been thinking about James today. He came back 3 years ago before he died. Didn't tell Clint because Clint doesn't need to know the ugly details. James was sick, liver failing from the drinking. He wanted to apologize, wanted forgiveness. I gave it to him, of course. He's my son. But he also wanted the land, wanted me to sell it so he could have the money.
For what? I don't know.
Medicine, maybe, or one last run at the tables. I told him no. Told him the land was for Clint. He got angry, said I always loved Clint more than him. Maybe that's how it looked to him. But I loved them both, just in different ways. James needed saving, and I tried. But Clint needed something to come home to, and I could give him that. So I did. Clint stopped reading, his throat tight. His father had come back before he died. His grandfather had seen him, forgiven him, but protected the land from him. It must have torn the old man apart. He kept reading, pushing through the emotion. Made Clint the sole heir in my will. Didn't tell James. That was probably wrong, but I couldn't risk him contesting it or causing legal trouble. The land needs to go to Clint, clear and simple. James couldn't come back, not really. He was too broken. But Clint can. I know he can. He left because of pain, not weakness. There's a difference. Pain can heal. Weakness just spreads. The final entries were acceptance and peace mixed with physical decline. Heart's giving out. Doctor says I've got maybe a year, maybe less. Doesn't matter. I've done what I needed to do. Got everything organized in the barn. Letters explaining it all, maps showing the value, journals so he can understand the whole story. The saddle's ready, cleaned and oiled. The property is clear. If he comes back tomorrow or 20 years from now, it'll be waiting. That's all a man can do. Leave something worth finding. The last entry was dated 5 years ago. Feeling tired today. But content, everything's ready. When Clint comes back, he'll understand. He'll see what I built for him and why. Maybe he'll stay, maybe he won't. That's his choice. But at least he'll know he was loved. At least he'll know someone believed in him. That's legacy enough for me. Clint closed the journal and sat in the quiet of the house. Outside, night had fallen completely. Rusty's soft breathing came from the porch where the donkey had settled for sleep. His grandfather's voice came through those pages clearer than memory, more detailed than any conversation they'd had. The old man had been wiser than Clint had known, more strategic, more loving. He'd fought a battle that lasted decades, won it through persistence and sacrifice, and left everything for a grandson who'd abandoned him. No, not abandoned. His grandfather had never seen it that way. He'd seen it as a necessary leaving, a boy becoming a man on his own terms. And he'd kept the home fires burning until that man was ready to return. Clint stood and walked to the window. He could see the barn in the moonlight, solid and patient. Inside it, his grandfather's saddle hung waiting, perfectly preserved. A symbol of everything the old man had been and everything he'd given. The decision Clint had made earlier solidified into certainty. He wasn't just staying because he felt guilty or obligated. He was staying because his grandfather had shown him what mattered. Not buckles or glory, not running from pain, but building something that lasts. Creating something worth passing on. He had work ahead of him, years of it probably. But he had a foundation to build on, and that was more than most people got. The next morning, Clint woke with purpose for the first time in years. He'd slept deeply, dreamlessly, and rose with the sun feeling clearer than he had since arriving. There was still one sealed envelope at the bottom of the chest, the one marked, "Open when you decide." He'd decided. Time to open it. He made coffee and carried the envelope to the porch, where the light was good. The seal cracked easily, and inside he found 2 documents. The first was a property deed, official and notarized. The second was a letter several pages long in his grandfather's handwriting. He looked at the deed first. It showed the original property as his grandfather had owned it, 100 acres total, not 80. The main homestead was 80 acres, yes, but there was also a separate 20-acre parcel half a mile to the west. He'd known about it vaguely, a piece of land his grandfather had bought separately years ago with the intention of building a retirement cabin. But the deed showed something else. A bill of sale dated 15 years ago. The 20 acres sold to Riverside Development LLC for a price that made Clint's eyes widen. Not just good money, exceptional money. Far more than raw land should bring. He unfolded the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. His grandfather's voice came through the words as clearly as if the old man sat beside him. "Dear Clint, if you're reading this, you've decided to stay. I'm glad. I always believed you would, but I know it wasn't an easy choice. Nothing worth doing ever is. There are some things I need to explain, things the journal doesn't cover fully. First, about the land. The 20 acres I sold to Riverside wasn't just empty ground. It sat right on top of the best part of the aquifer, and it had spring access that made it extremely valuable. I knew that because I'd had it surveyed, same as the main property. When Riverside came calling, I realized I had leverage. They needed water access to make their development work, and I had what they needed on 2 parcels. So I made a deal. I'd sell them 1 parcel at premium price, and they'd leave the main homestead alone forever. Got it in writing, made it legal. The money from that sale paid off every debt your father's mistakes created and gave me breathing room to maintain the homestead proper. Clint paused, processing. His grandfather hadn't just sacrificed his retirement dream. He'd monetized it, used it strategically to secure everything else. The old man had been smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He continued reading. That parcel was supposed to be my golden years, Clint. I had plans drawn up for a small cabin, nothing fancy. A place to sit and watch the sunset, maybe do some fishing. I thought about it every day while I was working double shifts at the mill. It kept me going, that dream. But when the time came to choose between my comfort and your future, there wasn't really a choice at all. A man's legacy isn't land he dies on. It's what he leaves behind. I wanted you to have the main homestead free and clear. No debts, no pressure, no one trying to take it from you. That was worth more than any cabin. Clint's eyes burned, but he kept reading. Now I need to tell you about your father. This is the hard part, and I've gone back and forth about whether to tell you at all. But you deserve the truth. 3 years before he died, James came back. He was sick, liver failing, and he was scared. He wanted to reconcile, and I welcomed him with open arms. We had some good conversations in those final months. I got to tell him I loved him, got to hear him apologize for everything. It gave us both some peace. The handwriting grew a bit shakier in the next paragraph, as if the words were harder to write. But James also wanted money. He asked me to sell the homestead, said the development company would pay top dollar for it, said we could split the proceeds. When I refused, he asked me to make him a joint heir with you, or at least give him a share. He had debts, he said, people he owed. He needed help one more time. I told him no. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, Clint, telling my dying son that I wouldn't help him the way he wanted. But I knew where that money would go, not to medical bills or honest debts. It would go to gambling, to drinking, to all the places he'd poured money for 30 years. And more than that, if I made him an heir, he'd contest the will, cause legal problems, maybe force a sale even after he was gone. I couldn't risk it. Clint set the letter down for a moment, breathing hard. His father had been here, had tried one last time to get money from the land, and his grandfather had refused. He tried to imagine that conversation, the pain on both sides. He picked up the letter again. "So I made you the sole heir in my will." James died not knowing that. The lawyer advised it, said any mention of the inheritance might cause him to take legal action. So I kept it quiet. He died thinking I'd left everything to you, but not knowing it was official, absolute, iron clean. That secrecy eats at me sometimes. But I stand by the decision. Here's why. And this is important, Clint. You left home because of pain. You were hurt, angry, betrayed by your father's words and actions. You ran to find yourself, to build something of your own. That's what young men do. That's healthy. That's growth. But James left home because of weakness. He ran from responsibility, from consequences, from the work of healing. He spent his whole life running. Even at the end, he was trying to run from his debts, his mistakes, his choices. There's a difference between leaving to grow and leaving to escape. You're like me, Clint. You left to grow. Your father was different. He couldn't stop running. Some men can't. I loved him with everything I had, but I couldn't save him from himself. And I couldn't let his weakness take your future. The words hit Clint like a hammer. His grandfather had made a choice between his son and his grandson, had chosen Clint, not out of favoritism, but out of understanding. You're probably feeling guilty right now. Don't. Your father made his choices, lived his life. He had chances to change, to do better. He chose not to take them. That's not on you, and it's not even on me. We each carry our own weight in this life. I carried mine by working to save this land. James carried his by running from every hard thing he faced. You carried yours by building a life on your own terms, even if it was hard, even if you were alone. Now you have a chance to carry something else. This land, this legacy, this possibility. I'm asking you to take it, not out of obligation to me or guilt about your father. Take it because it's yours by right, because you earned it by coming back, by deciding to stay. The land is valuable, Clint, more than you probably realize. The water rights alone are worth a fortune, and they'll only get more valuable as time goes on. The timber can provide sustainable income for generations if managed right. I've left you detailed plans, contacts with foresters and water engineers, everything you need. You can make a good life here. More than that, you can build something that lasts. That's all I ever wanted for you, a foundation to build on. The rest is up to you. The letter continued with practical details. Bank account numbers, lawyer contacts, locations of important documents. But Clint barely saw them. His mind was reeling. His grandfather had chosen him over his own son, had kept that choice secret to protect both of them, had carried the weight of that decision alone, living with whatever guilt or doubt it caused, to make sure Clint had this chance, and his father, Clint's father, had come back. Had asked for money even while dying, had been refused, and had died without knowing the full truth. The complexity of it overwhelmed him. Love and failure intertwined, sacrifice and hard choices, grace given and grace withheld. The final paragraph of the letter was dated just weeks before his grandfather died. If you're reading this, I'm gone. But I'm not worried. You'll figure it out, Clint. You've got your grandmother's strength and my stubbornness, and maybe, hopefully, the wisdom to use both better than I did. The land is yours. The choice is yours. But know this, I believed in you every single day. When everyone else thought you'd never come back, I knew better. And I was right. I'm watching from the old oak tree now, proud as I've ever been. Do what you think is right. Whatever that is, it'll be enough. Love, Grandpa. Clint sat on the porch until his coffee grew cold. Around him, the homestead waited, broken but not beyond repair, neglected but not abandoned, old but not used up. His grandfather had fought for it, sacrificed for it, preserved it through sheer force of will and love. Now it was Clint's, completely, absolutely his. No strings, no complications, no shared inheritance to navigate. Just him and the land and the future. The weight of it pressed down on his shoulders, but it didn't crush him. Instead, it centered him. For the first time since he'd climbed on his first bull at 16, Clint knew exactly where he belonged and what he was meant to do. He stood and looked out over the clearing. Rusty grazed peacefully, the barn stood patient and waiting, and the forest beyond stretched deep and green. His forest now, his land, his responsibility and his possibility. His grandfather had believed he'd come back, had bet everything on it, and he'd been right. Now Clint had to prove that the bet was worth making. The next morning, Clint woke with the dawn and knew what needed to be done. Reading and processing was finished. Understanding had been achieved. Now came the work. He walked to the barn and found his grandfather's workshop in the back corner. It was like stepping into a time capsule. Tools hung on pegboards, each in its place, maintained despite years of disuse. His grandfather had been meticulous about his tools, had taught Clint the same lesson. Take care of what takes care of you. On a shelf sat a leather tool belt, worn smooth from decades of use. Beside it, a pair of work gloves, shaped to hands that were no longer here to fill them. Clint picked up the belt and ran his fingers over the leather. His grandfather's initials were stamped into it, and the pouches still held nails, screws, a measuring tape. The weight of it felt right in his hands. He strapped it on. The belt hung slightly loose. His grandfather had been a bigger man, broader in the shoulders and thicker in the waist from a lifetime of physical labor. But it fit well enough. Clint adjusted it and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a tool belt. It was a passing of responsibility, a tangible connection to the man who'd worn it before. The gloves were next. They fit better, though his grandfather's hands had been larger, more calloused. Clint pulled them on and made a fist, feeling the leather creak. These gloves had built fences, repaired roofs, and maintained a homestead through sheer determination. Now they'd do it again. He walked outside into the cool morning air. Rusty was already awake, watching him with those knowing eyes that donkeys have. Clint patted the animal's neck and looked up at the barn roof. It sagged in the middle, a testament to years of neglect and one hard winter too many. That seemed like a good place to start. He spent the first hour taking inventory. The barn needed more than just a new roof. It needed structural reinforcement, new siding in places, and general repair. The house needed even more, but the barn came first. His grandfather had always said that you take care of your animal's shelter before your own. By mid-morning, he'd made a list and was considering a trip to town for supplies when he heard a truck coming up the drive. Earl Henderson's pickup appeared through the trees, and behind it 2 more trucks followed. Earl climbed out along with 5 other men, all of them older, all of them wearing work clothes and carrying tools. Clint recognized a few faces from childhood, though age had changed them. "Heard you decided to stay," Earl said without preamble. "Figured you could use some help." One of the other men, a tall fellow with silver hair and a slight limp, stepped forward. "Name's Charlie Watson. Worked with your grandfather for 20 years. He was always talking about when you'd come back. Said you'd need help getting started." "We've got time today," another man added. "And tomorrow if you need it. Hell, most of us are retired." "We've got nothing but time." Clint felt his throat tighten. "I can't pay you," Earl snorted. "Your grandfather helped every man here at one time or another. Never asked for a dime. We're just returning the favor." He looked around at the property. "Roof first?" "Roof first," Clint agreed. They worked through the day like a well-oiled machine. These men knew what they were doing, had spent lifetimes building and repairing. They fell into easy rhythm, measuring and cutting, hammering and securing. Clint worked alongside them, his body remembering skills his grandfather had taught him years ago. During lunch break, they sat on the porch eating sandwiches Earl's wife had packed. The conversation was easy, filled with stories about his grandfather. "Man never complained," Charlie said. "Not once. And I know for a fact he was hurting. Arthritis got so bad in his last years, he could barely hold a hammer. But he kept working. Stubborn as an ox," another man said, but fondly. "Told him to retire, take it easy. He just laughed and said he had work to do. He was preparing this place for you," Earl said, looking at Clint. "We all knew it. Every repair he made, every improvement, he'd say, 'Clint will appreciate this when he gets back.' None of us thought you were actually coming, Charlie admitted. No offense, but 25 years is a long time. We figured you'd sold the place from wherever you were and moved on. But your grandfather never doubted, not even at the end. He told me the week before he died that you'd come back when you were ready, and everything would be waiting. The weight of their words settled over Clint, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was grounding. These men had watched his grandfather fight his long battle, had witnessed the faith that sustained him. Now they were here, making good on an unspoken promise to help his grandson. By evening, the roof was structurally sound. Not finished. They'd need more materials for the actual roofing, but the framework was repaired and reinforced. The barn would survive another winter. As the men packed up their tools, Earl approached Clint. "We'll be back next weekend. Bring more help. If you're serious about this place, we'll help you make it right." "Why?" Clint asked. "Why go to all this trouble?" Earl was quiet for a moment, looking out at the clearing. "Your grandfather was a good man. Best kind of man. He worked himself to death for you, even though you weren't here to see it. That kind of love deserves respect. And besides," he smiled slightly, "he always said you were worth the wait. Figure we should give you the chance to prove him right." After they left, Clint stood alone in the yard, watching the sun set. His body ached from the day's work, a good ache, the kind that came from doing something meaningful. He looked at his grandfather's tool belt, still strapped around his waist, and felt the connection across time. Same tools, same land, same purpose. Rusty wandered over and pushed his nose against Clint's shoulder, as if to say, "You did well today." "Thanks, buddy," Clint said, scratching the donkey's ears. "We both did." That night, he walked through the property in the fading light, seeing it with new eyes. Not just as it was, but as it could be. The house repaired and lived in. The barn restored to full function. The land managed sustainably, providing income while preserving its character. Gardens planted, fences mended, life returning to spaces that had been empty too long. His grandfather's plans were detailed, and Clint had spent the evening reviewing them. There was a strategy here, a vision of what the homestead could become. Not just a dwelling, but a working operation. Selective timber harvest could provide steady income without destroying the forest. The springs could supply water not just for the homestead, but potentially for neighbors if infrastructure was developed. There were even notes about agritourism, about people wanting to experience rural life without committing to it full-time. The old man had thought of everything, had laid groundwork for a future he'd never see, but believed would come to pass. Clint returned to the barn and stood looking at the saddle, still hanging perfectly preserved in its place. He reached out and touched it, feeling the smooth leather under his palm. This saddle represented everything his grandfather had been, traditional, well-crafted, maintained with care, built to last. "I'll make it work," Clint said aloud to the empty barn. "I don't know how yet exactly, but I'll figure it out. I promise." The barn was silent, but he felt something like approval in the stillness. Or maybe that was just his own heart finally settling into place. He spent another hour in the workshop, familiarizing himself with his grandfather's tools, making notes about what he'd need, planning the next stages of work. The house would require significant effort. New plumbing in places, electrical updates, general restoration. But it was solid. The bones were good. Everything here was good, he realized. Neglected but not destroyed. Worn but not broken. Just like him, maybe. Years of wandering had left him weathered and tired, but not beyond restoration. This place would heal him as he healed it. That seemed like a fair exchange. As he finally headed to bed, exhausted but satisfied, he paused at his grandfather's grave. He'd found it earlier in the week, under the old oak tree his grandfather had mentioned in the letters. The marker was simple, just a stone with a name and dates. But the spot was peaceful, overlooking the clearing and the mountains beyond. "Got some help today," Clint said to the stone. "Your friends came by, good men. They told me stories about you, about how you never stopped talking about me coming back. I'm sorry I took so long. Sorry I wasn't here at the end. But I'm here now, and I'm staying. Going to fix this place up the way you planned. Going to make it work. I promise. A breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves on the oak. It sounded almost like a voice, almost like approval. Clint touched the marker gently, then walked back to the house. Sleep came easily that night, dreamless and deep. For the first time in 25 years, he was home. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he belonged. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more steps toward transformation. But tonight, he rested in the knowledge that he was on the right path. His grandfather had believed he'd come back, had worked himself to exhaustion, preparing for that return. The least Clint could do was prove that belief was justified. He closed his eyes and let the silence of the homestead settle around him. Outside, Rusty kept watch. The barn stood solid. The land waited patiently. And somewhere, Clint could almost imagine his grandfather smiling, finally able to rest, knowing his work was done and his faith had been rewarded. 3 months passed in a blur of work and transformation. The barn now stood straight and sound, its roof complete and weatherproof. The house had new windows and a functional kitchen. Earl and his crew had returned every weekend, bringing more volunteers each time. The community had rallied around the restoration, treating it as their own project, their own memorial to a man they'd respected. But on this particular November morning, with frost on the ground and winter threatening, Clint faced a choice that would define everything that followed. He'd received a letter the day before. Official letterhead, lawyer's language, but the message was simple. Riverside Development was making an offer for the property, a serious offer. The number was staggering, enough to set him up for life, to never have to work again, to buy ease and comfort and freedom from responsibility. The letter sat on the kitchen table now, along with his morning coffee, and Clint stared at it like it might bite him. The timing was almost suspicious. 3 months of hard work, of community investment, of slowly building something real. And now this. A final test, maybe. A last temptation. He picked up the letter and read it again. The language was professional, respectful even. They acknowledged the property's value, the water rights, the timber. They weren't trying to lowball him or trick him. This was a legitimate offer, probably the best he'd ever receive. They mentioned development plans, luxury homes, sustainable community, preserving the natural character of the land. They painted a picture of progress and prosperity, of his grandfather's vision, fulfilled through modern means. But Clint knew better. He'd spent 3 months walking this land, learning its rhythms, understanding its value beyond money. His grandfather had refused this offer, or ones like it, for 2 decades. Not because he was stubborn or foolish, but because he understood that some things shouldn't be bought or sold. Rusty brayed from outside, and Clint looked up to see Earl's truck coming up the drive. It was Saturday, workday, but Earl was early and alone. The old man climbed out slowly and walked to the porch. His face was serious. "Heard you got a letter from Riverside," he said without preamble. "News travels fast," Clint replied. "Small community. People talk." Earl sat down on the porch step, groaning slightly as his knees protested. "Mind if I speak plain?" "Please. That's a lot of money they're offering. Life-changing money. And nobody here would blame you for taking it. You put in good work these past months, fixed this place up nice. You could sell high and walk away clean." Clint waited, knowing there was more. "But," Earl continued, "your grandfather spent 20 years saying no to that same money. Worked himself to death saying no. And he did it for you. Not to trap you or obligate you, but to give you a choice. The choice he never had when he was young and struggling. The choice your father never got because he couldn't handle it." "I know," Clint said quietly. "Do you?" Earl looked at him directly. "Because I'm not sure you do. Your grandfather didn't just save this land. He saved the idea of it. The possibility that a man could have something that mattered more than money, could build something that lasted beyond his own life, could leave a legacy that meant something." He paused. "We've all been watching you these 3 months, watching to see if you understood what he gave you. Not just 80 acres and some water rights. He gave you purpose. He gave you proof that you mattered enough that someone would sacrifice everything to give you a future." The words hit Clint like a fist to the chest. He looked down at the letter, at all those zeros, at the promise of easy life. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Scared I'll fail. Scared I'm not strong enough to do what he did. Scared I'll let him down. That's good," Earl said. "Fear means you understand what's at stake. Your grandfather was scared too. I saw it in him, especially toward the end. Scared he'd die before you came back. Scared you wouldn't understand what he'd done or why. But he did it anyway, because fear doesn't matter as much as commitment." Clint stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the property. 3 months of work had transformed it, but it was still just the beginning. Years of effort stretched ahead, maintaining the land, developing sustainable practices, building something real. It would be hard work, uncertain work, lonely work at times, or he could take the money and walk away. Start over somewhere else, buy comfort and security. Let someone else carry the weight. What did my grandfather say about this land? Clint asked. When he was dying. What were his last words about it? Earl was quiet for a moment. He said, "It's waiting for him. Everything he needs is waiting. He just has to decide to take it." Clint nodded slowly. The fear was still there, would probably always be there. But underneath it was something stronger, a sense of rightness, of fitting into a space that had been carved out specifically for him. His grandfather had believed he'd come back, had bet everything on it. Now Clint had to decide if he believed in himself as much as his grandfather had believed in him. Clint stood there for a long time, the letter in his hand, the morning cold seeping through his jacket. Earl remained on the porch step, patient and silent, letting him work through it. Finally, Clint walked inside and found matches by the stove. He came back out and held the letter up. Earl watched without comment as Clint struck a match and touched it to the corner of the paper. The flame caught quickly, spreading across the expensive letterhead, consuming the offer and all its promises. Clint held it until the heat reached his fingers, then dropped it to the dirt and watched it burn to ash. "That's your answer?" Earl asked. "That's my answer." Earl stood slowly, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "Good, because I brought the crew. They're waiting down at the road. Wouldn't come up until they knew which way you'd chosen. I'll signal them." He walked to his truck and flashed the headlights twice. Within minutes, 4 more trucks appeared, filled with men and tools and purpose. Charlie Watson was the first out, grinning wide. "Heard you might be making a decision today. Glad you made the right one. How did you all know about the offer?" Clint asked. "Riverside made the same offer to your grandfather every 2 years like clockwork," Earl said. "And we figured they'd try you too, once they saw you were serious about staying. They're persistent, if nothing else." The men set to work without further discussion. Today's project was the house's foundation, which needed reinforcement on the south side where settling had occurred. It was technical work, requiring jacks and supports and careful attention. As they worked, Clint found himself standing in the barn again, looking at his grandfather's saddle. The decision he'd made felt right, but the magnitude of it was settling in. He'd turned down more money than he'd ever seen in his life, had committed himself to years of hard work with no guarantee of success, had chosen difficulty over ease, but he'd also chosen meaning over comfort, legacy over convenience. He'd chosen to honor his grandfather's sacrifice by accepting the gift fully, completely, without reservation. Earl found him there an hour later. "You all right?" "I think so," Clint said. "Just realizing what I've done. You've done what needed doing. What your grandfather hoped you'd do." Earl walked over to the saddle and ran his hand over the leather. "You know what this represents? Not just a tool for working. It's a symbol. Your grandfather kept it perfect for 25 years because he knew you'd understand what it meant when you saw it. It meant he was ready. The work was done. All you had to do was show up and take the reins." "I'm not sure I'm ready," Clint admitted. "Nobody's ever ready. Your grandfather wasn't ready when he had to take over this place from his father. He was young, just married, had no idea what he was doing. But he learned. He built. He persevered. That's what you do. You don't wait until you're ready. You start and you become ready through the doing." They walked outside together and Earl pointed to the work crew. "See those men? Every one of them struggled at some point. Lost jobs, lost loved ones, lost their way. But they kept going. Built lives worth living. They're here because they understand what you're trying to do. They want to help because they know how hard it is to build something real. Clint watched the men work, their movements efficient and practiced. They were building more than a foundation for a house. They were building a community, reinforcing connections, honoring memory through action. My grandfather knew I'd come back, Clint said. But how? How could he be so certain? Earl smiled. Because he knew you. Knew what was in you even if you didn't know it yourself. He used to say you were like him. Too stubborn to quit, too honest to live a lie. You left because staying would have broken you. But leaving meant you'd eventually need to come home. It was just a matter of time. The work continued through the day, and by evening the foundation was solid. The house would stand another 100 years if maintained properly. As the men packed up, each one came to shake Clint's hand. Proud of you, Charlie said simply. Your grandfather would be too, another added. After they left, Clint stood alone in the yard with Rusty. The donkey had been unusually quiet all day, as if he understood the significance of what had happened. We're staying, Clint said to him. For real this time. No running, no second guessing. This is home now. Rusty brayed softly, approval in the sound. Clint walked to his grandfather's grave and knelt beside the marker. I turned them down, he said. Burned the letter right there in the yard. I'm keeping this place, Grandpa. Going to make it work just like you planned. I'm not scared anymore. Well, maybe I am, but I'm doing it anyway. That's what you would have done. The wind moved through the oak tree, gentle and constant. Clint stood and looked back at the homestead. His homestead now, truly and completely. The barn stood solid, the house waited warm and welcoming. The land stretched out in all directions, full of possibility. He'd made his choice. Now came the living of it. Spring came slowly that year, the winter releasing its grip reluctantly across the mountains. But when it finally arrived, it brought with it new growth and new possibilities. Clint stood on the porch of the restored house, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over land that felt less like inheritance now and more like home. 6 months had passed since he'd burned Riverside's offer. 6 months of steady work, slow progress, and gradual transformation. The homestead looked different now, lived in, cared for, purposeful. The barn stood straight and solid. The house had fresh paint. Gardens had been planted where overgrowth once reigned. Fences had been mended. The property hummed with quiet life. Rusty grazed in the near pasture, no longer alone. Clint had bought 2 horses. Nothing fancy, just solid working animals, and they'd settled in well. The barn had occupants again, and the sound of animals moving about brought a completeness to the place that had been missing. Earl's truck appeared on the drive right on time. The old man came every Saturday still, though these days it was more for coffee and conversation than work. They'd become friends, the kind of friendship that didn't require many words but ran deep. Morning, Earl said, climbing the porch steps. Morning. Coffee's hot. They sat together in companionable silence, watching the day brighten. Earl finally spoke. Heard from the Forestry Service yesterday. They approved your management plan. That's good news, Clint said. The plan had taken months to develop, a strategy for sustainable timber harvest that would provide income while preserving the forest's health. It was based on his grandfather's notes, but updated with modern practices. The approval meant he could start generating revenue, making the homestead self-sustaining. Your grandfather would be proud. He had the same idea, just never lived to see it implemented. I'm just following his map, Clint said. Everything I'm doing, he laid the groundwork for. Sometimes I feel like I'm just completing work he started. That's what legacy is, Earl said. One generation starts something, the next carries it forward. Nobody does it alone. We're all just links in a chain. They sat for a while longer, then Earl said, Got something for you. Been meaning to give it to you for a while now. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it over. Clint opened it to find a photograph. 3 men stood in front of the barn, younger versions, smiling and squinting in the sun. It took him a moment to recognize them. His grandfather on the left, Earl on the right, and between them another man. That's my father, Clint said, surprised. He'd seen few pictures of his father young, before the drinking and gambling had carved lines into his face. Taken about 35 years ago, Earl said. Before things went bad. before your grandmother died. We were all friends then, the three of us. Your father was a good man before grief broke him. Your grandfather never forgot that. He loved the man his son had been, even while mourning the man he became. Clint studied the photograph, seeing his father's smile, seeing the potential that had never quite manifested. My grandfather chose me over him. He chose the future over the past, Earl corrected gently. Your father was trapped in what he'd lost. You were always moving forward, even when you were running. Your grandfather understood the difference. He knew you'd come back when you were ready. He knew your father never would. Do you think he would have forgiven me if I'd taken Riverside's offer? Earl smiled. He forgave your father for far worse. Forgave him even when your father couldn't forgive himself. Your grandfather understood that people do what they can with what they've got. He just hoped you'd have enough to choose the harder path. They finished their coffee as the sun climbed higher. Earl left eventually, and Clint spent the rest of the morning working in the barn, organizing tools, planning the week's projects. The rhythm of it felt natural now, the work no longer overwhelming but satisfying. In the afternoon, he saddled one of the horses and rode the property boundaries, something he did weekly now. He checked fence lines, noted any damage, observed the land's condition. His grandfather had done the same for decades, and now Clint understood why. It wasn't just maintenance, it was relationship. Learning the land, listening to what it needed, staying connected to it. He stopped at his grandfather's grave on the way back. Fresh wildflowers grew there now. He'd planted them in the fall, and they'd survived the winter. His grandfather would have liked that, beauty emerging from attention and care. Got the forestry plan approved, Clint said to the stone. Starts next month. We'll thin the south stand first, just like you marked on the maps. Selective cutting, leave the strongest trees. It'll generate enough income to cover taxes and maintenance for the year, with some left over. We're going to make it work, Grandpa. The homestead's going to make it. The wind moved through the oak tree, rustling the new leaves. Clint stood there a while longer, then mounted up and rode back to the barn. That evening, he sat on the porch with his grandfather's journal, reading entries he'd read before, but understanding differently now. His grandfather's voice came through the pages clearly, full of wisdom earned through hard years and harder choices. The journal had become Clint's guide, a reference he returned to when decisions needed making or perspective was required. The last entry, the one written just before his grandfather died, held new meaning now, feeling tired today, but content. Everything's ready. When Clint comes back, he'll understand. He'll see what I built for him and why. Maybe he'll stay, maybe he won't. That's his choice. But at least he'll know he was loved. At least he'll know someone believed in him. That's legacy enough for me. Clint closed the journal and looked out at the homestead as the sun set. 6 months ago, he'd arrived here broken and drifting, chasing something he couldn't name. Now he sat rooted, grounded home. The work ahead was clear. The purpose was defined. The future was possible. His grandfather had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, had worked and sacrificed and waited with patience that seemed superhuman, had left everything in place for a return he'd never witness, a future he'd never see. But he'd seen it in his mind, Clint realized. Every day for 25 years, his grandfather had seen this moment. His grandson returned, the land restored, the legacy preserved. He'd seen it with certainty, and that vision had sustained him through every difficulty. Now it was Clint's turn to see the future, to work towards something he might not live to complete, to build something that would outlast him. Someday, maybe there'd be someone else standing on this porch, reading these words, understanding this story. Someone who'd need to know they were believed in, that someone had faith in them, that there was a foundation waiting when they were ready to build. That was legacy, not just land or possessions, but the message carried forward. You matter, you're worth the wait, you're capable of more than you know. Rusty brayed from the barn, calling for his evening feed. Clint stood and smiled. The day's work was done. Tomorrow would bring more, it always did. But tonight, he rested in the knowledge that he'd made the right choice. His grandfather's faith had been rewarded. The homestead would continue. The story would go on. He walked across the yard as stars began appearing overhead. Inside the barn, his grandfather's saddle hung in its place, perfectly preserved, waiting for the day someone would ride it again. Clint touched the leather gently as he passed, a gesture of thanks, a promise kept. The past and future met in that moment, in that touch. What had been given had been received. What had been started would be finished. And somewhere Clint felt certain his grandfather was smiling,